torc is a kind of ornamentation, a piece of jewellery, generally assumed to be a necklace because they're usually this kind of size, although you do also have some smaller pieces which some have suggested may have been worn as bracelets. The word torc comes from this idea of twisting because the majority of the pieces have this very twisted design throughout the majority of the piece. You then have these two end pieces, what are known as terminals, with generally a gap in between. However, not all torcs are twisted and not all torcs have a gap here. Some have some kind of fastening, which presumably would have been put together once the torc was situated around the neck. The majority are made from precious metals, specifically silver or gold, although you do have one or two examples made from bronze or iron or even lead, and some have suggested that very early examples might even have been made from twisted leather. What's fascinating is that even though you have a wide range of torcs throughout the whole of the European continent and Great Britain, no two torcs are exactly the same. You can see a slight difference in styles between different regions, but even within these styles, there's also a lot of differences and variation based on perhaps personal preference within the actual torcs themselves. What's really fascinating about these objects is that they are predominantly found in hoards, which is a collection of objects that would have been deposited in the ground. There's many different theories as to why people would have deposited these hoards. The most common suggestion is that it is some kind of ritual deposition, although some have suggested it may have been a form of safekeeping, for example, to protect your belongings from invaders, for example. They have been found mainly in the British Isles. That's where the majority of them have been found. There's been around 400 pieces found, although only a very small selection of them have been complete. However, you do also find them scattered throughout the European continent. You do see a slight variation in styles, as I mentioned last week, within these different locations. So, for example, in the UK, you mainly have ring torcs, which means that the terminals have a big ring on the end. The most famous example of this is the Snettisham torc, which was found in Norfolk, dates to the Iron Age, and it comprises of 1 kilo's worth of gold. You then have, for example, in the French and German regions, what we now call France and Germany, you have this more connected torc, so with an actual fastening, and that would have been a complete ring. And then on the Iberian Peninsula, you have more this kind of style, known as a kind of apple core style, or even a teardrop shape at the end. It's very hard to know exactly when a torc was made because even though they are discovered in these hoards, and you can date the hoard, for example, by looking at the stratigraphic soil layer or even the presence of coins which have a specific date on them, that doesn't necessarily mean that the torc was made at the same time that it was put in the ground. It could have been around for hundreds of years, being passed down through families before it was eventually deposited. However, it's generally assumed that these objects would have been associated with the Celtic peoples. This is based on historic records that we have, for example, from Roman histories, but also from the dating which generally forms within the European Iron Age. So, however, depending on where exactly in Europe you are, this could also vary a lot between, for example, the 8th century BC and the 3rd century AD. They were probably made by specialist jewelers. However, exactly who these jewelers were, whether they were men or women, whether they were specific families or particular apprentices, is still something that is unknown within the archaeological community. How would a torc have been made? Well, it's assumed that the bits of metal would have been twisted together, and then the terminals here would actually have been made separately. It's generally assumed that they would have been cast before being added on to create the final piece. How would a torc have been worn? Quite simply by putting it around your neck and wearing it on the collarbones here. Although quite a lot of depictions suggest that actually it would have been closed even further, so you would have had to open it a little bit to put it around your neck. The most famous depiction is the Roman statue known as the Dying Gaul, which depicts a man wearing nothing but a closed torc like this. Why would people have worn torcs in the past? Well, some suggest that it was just a form of everyday jewellery, especially considering that you have some very simplified versions. But considering that they are found in the majority of hoards or burials, it's assumed that they had some kind of ceremonial meaning, perhaps, especially because some of them are so intricately detailed. We can never really know. There is still a lot of research being done on these torcs, and the fact that you don't actually have very many that have been found mean that this is a very exciting and very potential-filled avenue of future research.